The billionaire forbidden love towards the pregnant woman that helped him. She saved a billionaire's life. Now he can't let her go. Discover how a billionaire's life changed forever when a brave pregnant woman showed up just in time. Love and fate collide in the most unexpected way. Before we go into details, click subscribe, like and comment where you're watching from. I would be glad to know this story goes as far as Canada, all of the United States of America, Australia, Africa, and even the United Kingdom. So let me know where you're watching from on comments section. I pray may the good God Almighty bless and preserve you all and your family. Amen. Let's begin. The rain was relentless that night, a steady downpour that blurred the city lights into streaks of silver and gold. The streets of Manhattan, usually buzzing with confidence and control, now felt chaotic, as if nature itself was rebelling against the power and wealth that defined the skyline. Ethan Blackwood, a man whose name commanded respect across boardrooms and headlines, had never felt so small. His sleek black car had swerved out of control after a careless driver cut him off, slamming into the guardrail of a narrow side street. Smoke hissed from the hood, and for the first time in years, Ethan realized just how fragile his life truly was. He stumbled out of the car, clutching his arm, pain slicing through his ribs. His expensive tailored suit was ruined, soaked in rain and streaked with blood. The billionaire who could buy anything suddenly found himself helpless, lost, and exposed. That's when he saw her. A young woman appeared from the shadows, her umbrella barely shielding her from the storm. She moved quickly, her steps uneven yet determined. Her coat was oversized, but it couldn't hide the curve of her swollen belly. She was pregnant, and she was alone. "Sir, are you all right?" she called out, her voice trembling but strong enough to pierce the sound of the storm. Ethan tried to wave her away, pride fighting against pain. "I'm fine, just leave." But she didn't. Instead, she pushed the umbrella into his hands and crouched beside him, her eyes scanning his injuries with an intensity that startled him. They were warm eyes, filled with concern rather than fear. "You're not fine," she said firmly. "You're bleeding. We need to stop it." He wanted to protest. He was Ethan Blackwood. Men didn't rescue him, much less strangers. Yet his legs wavered, and for the first time, he let someone take control. The woman tore a strip from her own scarf and pressed it against the cut on his forehead. He flinched at the sting, but she didn't hesitate. Her hands were steady, surprisingly gentle. "Hold this," she ordered softly, guiding his hand to the makeshift bandage. Ethan stared at her in disbelief. She had nothing. Her clothes were worn, her shoes cheap, her hands calloused from work. But she treated him as if he were someone worth saving. Not the billionaire, not the headline, just a man in pain. "Why are you helping me?" he asked, his voice hoarse. She paused, her lips parting as if she almost didn't have an answer. Then, with quiet resolve, she whispered, "Because you needed me." The words struck him deeper than the crash ever could. As the sirens wailed in the distance, Ethan realized something impossible. In the cold, indifferent city where money bought loyalty and love came with conditions, a stranger, an exhausted, pregnant stranger, had chosen to save him with nothing to gain, and for reasons he couldn't yet explain. That simple act of kindness unsettled him more than all his wealth ever comforted him. That was the night Ethan Blackwood's world began to change. That was the night he met her. The hospital room smelled faintly of antiseptic, the kind of sterile scent that clung to the walls and lingered in the air. Ethan hated it. He wasn't used to feeling weak, confined to a narrow bed under harsh fluorescent lights. Normally, he was the man signing hospital checks, funding medical wings with his name etched into marble plaques. Not the man lying under thin sheets with a bandaged arm and bruised ribs. But as his eyes adjusted to the pale morning light streaming through the blinds, his thoughts weren't on himself. They were on her. The woman, he didn't even know her name. She'd disappeared shortly after the ambulance arrived, slipping into the shadows as quickly as she had emerged from them. No questions asked. No attempt to linger or take advantage of the situation. Just a quiet exit, as though she'd only stepped into his life for that single moment. Ethan wasn't used to people walking away from him. They clung to him, investors, partners, women who adored the security his money brought. Everyone wanted something, but she had wanted nothing. He couldn't shake it. Later that day, when his driver came to take him back to his penthouse, Ethan stared out of the tinted windows, watching the city shift around him. Manhattan was a world of glass towers and private clubs, yet beneath the skyscrapers, hidden in alleys and subway stations, another world existed, a world he rarely saw and even more rarely acknowledged. And somehow she belonged to that world. Before we go into details, click subscribe, like, and comment where you're watching from. I would be glad to know this story goes as far as Canada, all of the United States of America, Australia, Africa, and even the United Kingdom. So let me know where you're watching from on comments section. I pray may the good God Almighty bless and preserve you all and your family. Amen. Let's begin. Across the city, in a small, rundown apartment, Clara Bennett set down a paper bag of groceries on the chipped kitchen counter. The bag was lighter than she wanted it to be. Eggs, bread, milk, and one small pack of fruit she'd splurged on. She rubbed her swollen belly, whispering softly to the little life inside her. "We'll make it work," she murmured. "We always do." The rent was overdue. Her savings, already meager, had nearly vanished after her last doctor's appointment. The baby's father, well, she didn't let herself think about him anymore. He had walked away the moment responsibility became real, leaving her to carry the weight alone. Yet Clara wasn't bitter. Tired, yes. Afraid, often. But not bitter. She couldn't afford to be. She worked double shifts at the diner, serving coffee with a smile even when her feet ached and her back screamed, because the baby deserved more than her pain. That night, after the rescue, she had gone home shivering from the rain, her scarf torn and her shoes ruined. She hadn't even thought of who the man was. Only later, as the diner TV played a news segment, had she realized the truth. Ethan Blackwood, the billionaire. The man whose face appeared on Forbes covers, who owned skyscrapers, who could buy her entire neighborhood and barely notice. Clara had stared at the screen, her hand frozen on the coffee pot. The man she had saved wasn't just anyone. He was someone who lived in a world galaxies away from her own. Ethan, however, couldn't let it go. 2 days later, he found himself in his office, staring at a report his assistant had placed on his desk. He'd asked her to track the woman down. Quietly, discreetly. Normally, Ethan would never waste time chasing after strangers. But this wasn't normal. "She works at a diner on the Lower East Side," his assistant reported, her tone cautious. "Her name is Clara Bennett. Single, pregnant, no criminal record. Financially, struggling." Struggling? The word echoed in his head like a drumbeat. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. He didn't like the feeling gnawing at him. It wasn't pity, he despised pity. It was something else, something heavier. That evening, while his penthouse buzzed with silence and his glass of scotch remained untouched, Ethan found himself wondering what her life was like. Did she have anyone to lean on? Did she even know how much she'd risked by stopping for him that night? He thought about her eyes. The way she'd said, "Because you needed me." No one had ever spoken to him like that. No one had ever cared without expecting something in return. And he realized, with a strange mix of dread and anticipation, that he couldn't just walk away. Not from her. Not from Clara Bennett. 2 worlds had collided that stormy night. His built on money and steel, hers on survival and hope, and whether either of them wanted it or not, the collision had only just begun. The silver Bentley pulled up to the curb outside Maggie's diner, its polished frame gleaming under the weak afternoon sun. It looked absurd parked there, like a diamond set in broken glass. The Lower East Side street was cracked and uneven, littered with potholes and fading storefronts. Locals slowed their steps to gawk, whispering behind their hands. Expensive cars didn't belong here. But Ethan Blackwood didn't care about belonging. He stepped out, adjusting the cuff of his tailored coat, ignoring the stares. His driver tried to protest. "Sir, are you sure you want to?" But Ethan silenced him with a look. He had never been a man who explained himself. The diner door jingled as he entered, the scent of coffee and fried bacon wrapping around him. It was a far cry from the Michelin-starred restaurants he frequented. But somehow, the simple hum of voices and clatter of dishes felt grounding. And then he saw her. Clara Bennett. Her back was to him. Her hair pulled into a messy bun, strands escaping as she balanced a tray of steaming plates. She moved carefully, but with the weariness of someone who had been on her feet too long. The swell of her belly was more noticeable now. Pressing against her faded uniform, Ethan's chest tightened unexpectedly. She looked fragile and strong all at once. When she turned and spotted him, the tray wobbled. Shock flickered across her face, quickly masked by suspicion. "What are you doing here?" she asked, setting the tray down with a clatter. Ethan didn't flinch. "We need to talk." Her eyes narrowed. "If this is about the other night." "It is." He stepped closer, lowering his voice so the curious customers wouldn't hear. "You helped me. You saved me. And I don't leave debts unpaid." Clara's hands tightened around the edge of the counter. For a moment, she seemed almost amused. "You think I did that for a reward?" "Everyone wants something," Ethan said flatly. It was a truth he'd lived by, a rule that had never failed him. But Clara only shook her head. "Not me." The simplicity of her words unsettled him. No negotiation, no hesitation, just refusal. "You risked yourself that night," he pressed, his jaw set. "At the very least, I can make things easier for you. Financial support, medical care, whatever you need." Her cheeks flushed with a mix of anger and pride. "I don't need your money." For a long moment, they stood locked in silence, two worlds colliding again in the narrow space of the diner. Finally, Clara exhaled, her voice softening. "That night wasn't about you being Ethan Blackwood. It wasn't about your money or your name. You were hurt. You were a man who needed help. That's all I saw." Ethan's throat tightened. He wasn't used to being stripped down to something so human. No titles, no power, just a man. But before he could respond, a customer called for her, and Clara turned away, slipping back into her routine as if he were just another stranger. Later, when her shift ended, she stepped outside into the chilly evening. To her irritation, Ethan was waiting, leaning casually against his car as if the cracked sidewalk were a red carpet. "You're persistent," she muttered, pulling her coat tighter around her belly. "I'm thorough," he corrected smoothly. "There's a difference." Clara rolled her eyes, but a small laugh escaped her. The sound caught him off guard. It was light, unguarded, nothing like the polished laughter he usually heard at galas or boardrooms. "Why does it matter so much to you?" she asked, her tone gentler now. Ethan hesitated. For once, he didn't have a rehearsed answer. "Because you didn't ask for anything. And I don't know how to live in a world where someone can give without wanting something back." Clara's expression softened, though her voice remained firm. "Then maybe it's time you learn." With that, she walked away, her figure disappearing into the dusky street, leaving Ethan standing by his Bentley. Richer than most men could dream, yet strangely hollow. For the first time in his life, gratitude felt heavier than gold. The diner was nearly empty when Clara hung up her apron that night. The neon sign buzzed outside the window, flickering in and out, painting her reflection in tired hues of pink and blue. Her back ached, her swollen ankles throbbed, but what weighed on her most was the silence that it was in those quiet hours, when she was no longer distracted by orders and trays, that the fears crept in. She sat at a corner booth, resting her hand on her belly. The baby kicked gently, as if reminding her it was there, reminding her why she couldn't fall apart. "You'll be okay?" she whispered, though the words felt more like a prayer than a promise. Her mind drifted back to that night, the storm, the stranger she'd saved, Ethan Blackwood. She'd seen his face on magazine covers for years, his wealth and power spoken of like myths. And yet, when she had found him, bleeding and broken in the rain, he'd looked so human, vulnerable, almost like her. But Clara had no room in her life for billionaires, or for the messy emotions that followed them. She had learned the hard way that promises from men with power often came with hidden costs. A memory flickered. Uninvited, Daniel, her child's father, his charming smile, the way he had held her hand the night she told him she was pregnant. He had whispered words of love, of family, of forever, and she had believed him. But forever had ended quickly. When reality set in, doctor visits, financial stress, the weight of responsibility, Daniel's love dissolved into excuses. Then excuses turned into absence. One day he simply didn't come home. The phone calls went unanswered. His clothes disappeared from the closet. And Clara was left alone, staring at a positive pregnancy test and an empty bed. She had cried herself sick, begging for an explanation, for closure. But the truth was simple. He hadn't wanted her, hadn't wanted their child. That truth had hardened into fear, fear that no one could be trusted, fear that love was just another word for disappointment, fear that she wasn't enough. Not for Daniel, not for this child, not for anyone. Clara wiped her eyes roughly, refusing to let the tears win. She had no time for weakness. Not anymore. Across town, Ethan Blackwood sat in his penthouse, a glass of untouched scotch in his hand. The city sprawled beneath him, glowing with its endless rhythm of wealth and struggle. He had everything anyone could want: power, influence, luxury. And yet tonight, all he could think about was her. Clara Bennett. Her refusal to take his money had unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He'd offered women diamonds, cars, apartments, and they had all smiled and accepted. But Clara? She had turned her back on him without hesitation. He wasn't used to hearing no. And yet, in her no, he had seen something he couldn't define: strength, independence, a stubborn pride that rivaled his own. That he thought of her tired eyes, the way she had cradled her stomach absent-mindedly, as if already protecting the child. She carried the weight of her world alone, and still, she had stopped for him. For Ethan, vulnerability had always been weakness. He had built walls of steel around himself, hiding his scars behind money and control. But Clara seemed to live in her vulnerability, wear it like armor, and he couldn't look away. The next morning, Ethan made a decision. He arrived at the diner just before Clara's shift began, waiting outside in the cold. When she rounded the corner, bundled in her thin coat, she stopped in her tracks. "You again," she muttered, pulling her scarf tighter. "Me again," he replied calmly. "Don't you have skyscrapers to run or empires to build?" "I do," he said, a hint of amusement in his tone. "But today I'm here." Clara sighed, brushing past him toward the door. "I told you, I don't want your money. I'm not offering money." His voice was quieter now, almost careful. "I'm offering company." She paused, looking at him skeptically. "Company?" Ethan nodded. "Sit with me, just for a coffee. That's all." Clara hesitated, her instincts screaming to keep her distance. Men like him didn't simply want company. They wanted control or influence or something. But when she looked into his eyes, she didn't see arrogance. She saw sincerity, laced with something unexpected: loneliness. Against her better judgment, she agreed. Inside the diner, they sat across from each other in a booth. For once, Ethan wasn't the untouchable billionaire. He was just a man, asking questions about her life, listening when she spoke. And slowly, carefully, Clara began to let pieces of her truth slip out. The long shifts, the rent notices, the baby who would arrive in just a few months. But not everything. Not Daniel. Not the heartbreak. Not the fear that kept her awake at night. Those secrets were hers to keep, for now. That morning, as Ethan left the diner, he knew two things for certain. Point one, Clara Bennett was nothing like anyone he had ever known, and two, the walls she kept around her heart were taller than even the skyscrapers he owned, and for reasons he couldn't yet explain. He wanted to be the one to climb them. The Blackwood Tower soared 50 stories above the city, its glass facade reflecting the skyline like a crown. To outsiders, it was a symbol of Ethan Blackwood's success, his empire, his legacy, his fortress. But to Ethan, it was more than a building. It was a wall. That he stood in his office, staring out over Manhattan as the city pulsed below. He was surrounded by silence, the kind that pressed into the bones. Behind him, polished mahogany shelves groaned under the weight of awards, stock reports, and photographs carefully chosen for display. Smiles frozen in time, handshakes caught in glossy frames. Nothing personal, nothing real. Because real was dangerous. Ethan had learned that long ago. He had been 12 years old the night his father walked out. Richard Blackwood. Charming, ruthless, a man who treated business like war, had decided that family was a liability. One suitcase, one slammed door, and he was gone, leaving Ethan and his mother with little more than the echo of betrayal. Ethan's mother, Catherine, had tried to hold everything together, but grief clung to her like a second skin. Nights were spent crying softly in the kitchen. Mornings were painted with a smile that never reached her eyes. And then, when Ethan was 17, she was gone too. Cancer taking her quietly, leaving him completely alone. The boy who had once believed in bedtime stories and unconditional love had grown into a man who trusted nothing but numbers. Business was predictable. Money was loyal. Love was a weakness he could not afford, so he built his walls. High, unshakable, impenetrable. Behind them, he rose to power, crushed rivals, and became untouchable at least. That's what he told himself. But Clara Bennett had cracked something in those walls that unsettled him. The way she had looked at him with no agenda. The way she had saved him without knowing his name. He kept telling himself it was gratitude pulling him back to her. But deep down, he knew it was more. When she smiled, though rare, it wasn't the polished, performative smile of high society. It was raw, honest, and every time he saw it, something in his chest tightened in a way he didn't understand. That evening, Ethan met with his closest friend and confidant, Julian Hart, in a private club uptown. Julian was one of the few people Ethan trusted, a sharp-minded lawyer who had known him since college. "You're distracted," Julian said, sipping his whiskey. "That's not like you." Ethan leaned back, his jaw tightening. "I met someone." Julian raised a brow. "A woman? Since when do you let women distract you?" "This one's different." Julian smirked. "They always are until they aren't." Ethan ignored the jab, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "She's pregnant." That made Julian pause. "Pregnant? She saved me the night of the crash." Ethan's voice was low, almost defensive. "She didn't want anything from me. Not money, not connections. Nothing." Julian studied him for a long moment before shaking his head. "Ethan, be careful. You've built a life on control. Bringing someone like that into your world, you can't control her. And you hate what you can't control." The words stung because they were true. Control had always been Ethan's shield. If he held the power, he couldn't be abandoned. If he made the rules, no one could break him. But Clara Bennett, she didn't fit into rules or power. She simply was. And that terrified him. Later that night, back in his penthouse, Ethan sat in the quiet dark. His phone buzzed with business alerts. His email chimed with opportunities. But his attention remained elsewhere. On the small scrap of paper tucked into his pocket, the one with Clara's phone number written in her neat, hesitant handwriting. She had given it reluctantly after their coffee, as if uncertain whether he'd use it. His hand hovered over the phone, his heart pounding in a way it hadn't since he was a boy. Calling her meant opening a door, and opening doors had never ended well for him. Still, he dialed. The line rang once, twice, and then her voice, soft and cautious, filled the silence. "Hello." Ethan swallowed, his throat tight. "Clara, it's me." For a moment, there was nothing but quiet. Then, the faintest hint of warmth colored her reply. "I was wondering when you'd call." For the first time in years, Ethan felt the walls around him shift. Not crumbling yet, but trembling. And though fear clawed at his chest, another feeling rose stronger. Hope. The first time Ethan and Clara sat together outside the diner. It was on a cracked bench that wobbled whenever someone shifted their weight. The paint was peeling, the metal rusting, but for Clara, it was her favorite spot after long shifts. She would sit there with a cup of tea, rubbing her belly and watching the city pass her by. Ethan didn't belong there. He looked out of place in his tailored coat, his shoes too clean for the stained sidewalk. And yet, he sat beside her, his long frame bent awkwardly, as if trying to fit into a life that wasn't his. "You're not built for benches like this," Clara teased, sipping from her paper cup. Ethan smirked faintly. "I've sat in worse places. Board meetings, for one." Clara laughed, the sound light and unguarded. It startled her how easily he could make her laugh, considering how heavy her days usually felt. For a while, they sat in silence, the hum of traffic filling the air. Clara felt the baby kick, and she instinctively placed her hand on her stomach. Ethan's gaze followed, lingering not in judgment, but in quiet curiosity. "Does it hurt?" he asked softly. Clara shook her head. "Not really. Strange. Like a reminder. Every little movement tells me I'm not alone, even when I feel like I am." Ethan's chest tightened at her words. He had never considered what it meant to carry life inside you, to bear responsibility in such a raw, physical way. He had always thought of legacy as numbers in a portfolio, buildings with his name engraved in stone. But Clara's legacy was kicking inside her, fragile yet powerful. Days turned into weeks, and their paths began to cross more often. Ethan stopped by the diner under the guise of craving coffee, though Clara suspected he'd never had diner coffee before in his life. She served him with an amused shake of her head, pretending not to notice the way he lingered longer than necessary. Sometimes, after her shift, he would walk her home. He kept his distance, never pushing, always respectful. It was strange. Ethan Blackwood, a man who had conquered empires, seemed almost shy in her presence. One evening, as they walked, rain began to fall, soft at first, then heavier. Clara groaned, pulling her thin coat tighter. "Of course, I forgot my umbrella." Without a word, Ethan shrugged off his coat and draped it over her shoulders. It was warm, far too large, and smelled faintly of cedar and something expensive she couldn't name. "You'll freeze," she protested. "I'll survive," he said simply. Something in the way he said it made her chest tighten, because she knew he meant more than the rain. But for every tender moment, there was hesitation. Clara caught herself staring at him sometimes, wondering what he was doing here, with her, when he could be anywhere else in the world. She wanted to trust him, to believe his kindness wasn't temporary. But Daniel's ghost lingered, whispering that men leave, men lie, men break, and Ethan. He had his own walls. One night, sitting in the diner after closing, Clara found the courage to ask, "Why me? Out of all the people in this city, why keep showing up for me?" Ethan looked at her across the dimly lit booth, his expression unreadable. Then, with a vulnerability that surprised them both, he said, "Because you see me. Not the billionaire, not the empire, just me. And I didn't realize how much I needed that." The words hung between them, fragile as glass. Clara felt her breath catch, her heart aching at the honesty in his eyes. She wanted to believe him. She almost did. But walls built from heartbreak and abandonment didn't fall easily. A week later, Clara invited him into her apartment for the first time. It was small, with creaking floors and mismatched furniture. But it was warm, lived in, filled with the quiet traces of her resilience. Ethan stood awkwardly in the doorway, taking it all in. "You live here?" Clara arched a brow. "What were you expecting? A penthouse?" He smirked, but his chest tightened again. The apartment was humble, but it was hers. And somehow, it felt more like home than his marble and glass palace ever had. She made tea, and they sat together on her worn couch. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt peace. No business calls, no shareholders, no pretenses. Just Clara, sipping her tea, the baby kicking gently, and a silence that felt safe instead of suffocating. He found himself thinking, "I could get used to this." But he didn't say it out loud, because fragile bonds, once spoken of too soon, had a way of shattering. For a few precious weeks, it felt as though Ethan and Clara existed in their own quiet world. Coffee at the diner, evening walks, whispered conversations in her modest apartment. It was fragile, imperfect, but it was theirs. That illusion shattered the morning Clara's face appeared on the front page of a tabloid. Billionaire Ethan Blackwood spotted with mystery pregnant woman, Romance or scandal? The headlines screamed from every newsstand, accompanied by grainy photographs of them walking together in the rain. His coat draped over her shoulders. Clara froze at the sight, her heart hammering. Her hands shook as she clutched the paper, her stomach twisting in dread. Customers at the diner whispered behind their menus, some openly staring. By noon, the whispers had turned into questions. Who was she? Was the baby his? The shame burned hotter than the coffee she poured. When Ethan arrived that evening, she confronted him before he could even speak. "This is your world," she said, slamming the newspaper onto the counter. "And I can't be part of it." Ethan's jaw clenched as he glanced at the headline. "I'll handle it." Clara shook her head, her voice trembling. You can't. You can't control what people say, what they think. I never asked for this, Ethan. I just wanted a quiet life for me and my baby." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "And I wanted to protect you, but I can't do that if you push me away." Her eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. "You don't understand. I've lived with judgment before, with whispers. I can't put my child through that. I won't." Across the city, Ethan's rivals pounced on the scandal like wolves. At a board meeting, one of his competitors smirked across the polished table. "Quite the story in the papers," he drawled. "A billionaire caught up with a waitress. Bold move, Ethan. Investors don't like distractions." The implication was clear. Ethan's judgment was being questioned. His empire, carefully built on control and respect, now had a crack. After the meeting, Julian cornered him in the corridor. "You need to think about what you're doing. This isn't just about you anymore. Every choice you make is scrutinized. Clara isn't from this world. She'll get torn apart." Ethan's response was a low growl. "Then I'll make sure she doesn't." But even as he said it, doubt gnawed at him. Could he protect her from the vultures circling? Or was he dragging her deeper into danger by standing at her side? Clara, meanwhile, retreated further into herself. At the diner, customers muttered cruel jokes under their breath. At the grocery store, she felt eyes on her back, the weight of judgment pressing down like stones. One evening, after a particularly brutal day, she sat in her apartment with the lights off, rocking gently on the couch as her baby shifted inside her. "You deserve better," she whispered, tears streaking her cheeks. "Better than me. Better than this chaos." When Ethan knocked on her door, she almost didn't answer, but his voice, steady, insistent, broke through. "Clara, let me in." She opened the door reluctantly, her eyes red. Ethan stepped inside, his gaze softening at the sight of her. "I didn't want this," she said brokenly. "I didn't want the cameras, the whispers, the headlines. I just wanted peace." Ethan reached for her hands, his voice low but fierce. "I know, and I swear to you, Clara, I'll do whatever it takes to give you that peace. But don't shut me out, please." Her heart ached at the rawness in his tone. She wanted to believe him, wanted to lean on him. But the fear of what the world could do to them lingered like a shadow. Still, for the first time, she didn't pull away. That night, as Ethan left, Clara stood at the window, watching the city lights flicker against the darkness. The world was against them. Society, the media, his rivals. But for the first time in her life, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to fight alone. The storm outside mirrored the storm in Ethan's chest. He stood at the tall windows of his penthouse, watching the rain hammer the glass. His empire stretched below. Glittering towers, flashing billboards, wealth measured in steel and light. Yet for the first time, none of it mattered. The board had delivered an ultimatum that morning. Step away from Clara Bennett, or risk losing everything. Investors were nervous, shareholders restless. The scandal had grown teeth, headlines multiplying like wildfire. Rumors claimed the baby was his, that he had abandoned some secret affair, that his empire was crumbling. Business rivals whispered gleefully, waiting for his fall. Ethan had never bowed to pressure. He had fought, clawed, and conquered his way to the top. But this was different, because now it wasn't only his reputation at stake. It was Clara. and she hadn't asked for any of it. Meanwhile, Clara sat on her worn couch, staring at the eviction notice slipped under her door. Her landlord had finally lost patience. She had 2 weeks to pay or leave. Her hands shook as she held the paper, her heart aching. She had always scraped by before. Double shifts, skipped meals, sleepless nights. But with the baby due in just a few months, she was running out of strength. Her first instinct was to call Ethan. He had offered to help so many times. One phone call and her problems would vanish. Rent, bills, doctor's appointments, solved. But that was the very reason she couldn't do it. Accepting his help would mean leaning on him, letting him carry her burdens. And what if he left like Daniel? What if she built her hope on him, only to watch it crumble? She couldn't risk that pain again. Clara crumpled the notice in her fist, whispering fiercely, "I'll figure it out. I have to." When Ethan showed up at her door that evening, she tried to hide the exhaustion in her eyes. He saw through it immediately. "What's wrong?" he asked. "Nothing," she lied. Ethan stepped closer, his voice sharp. "Don't do that. Don't shut me out." Her walls rose instinctively. "Not everything is your problem to fix, Ethan. I've been on my own this long. I can keep going." His frustration flared. "This isn't about fixing things. It's about not watching someone I care about drown while I stand on the shore." The word care caught in the air between them, heavy and dangerous. Clara's breath hitched, her heart pounding. "You don't understand," she whispered. "If I let you in, if I depend on you, and then you leave." Her voice cracked. "I don't know if I'd survive that." Ethan's expression softened, his own scars flickering in his eyes. "Clara, I've spent my life running from love because I thought it made me weak. But the truth is, it's the only thing that's ever made me feel alive. And I'm terrified, just like you." Tears slipped down Clara's cheeks, silent and unstoppable. The next day, Ethan made his choice at the board meeting. Surrounded by polished suits and cold stares, he stood tall. "You gave me an ultimatum, Clara or my empire. And I've decided." The room fell silent. Ethan's gaze hardened. "You can take my empire. You can strip my titles. But you will not take her." Gasps echoed around the table. His words were reckless, dangerous, the kind that could collapse everything he had built. But for the first time in years, he felt free. That evening, Clara made a choice of her own. She had spent hours staring at the eviction notice, her heart breaking. Finally, with trembling hands, she picked up the phone. When Ethan answered, his voice was steady, grounding. "Clara?" She swallowed hard. "I need help." The silence that followed was filled with more meaning than words. Not because she needed him, but because she trusted him enough to admit it. Ethan closed his eyes, relief flooding his chest. "I'll be there." Sacrifice had cost them both, his pride, her independence. But in those losses, something greater began to bloom. Not dependence, not weakness, partnership. And it was only the beginning. The days following Clara's phone call felt different. A shift, subtle at first, then undeniable. Ethan no longer hovered at the edges of her life. He was part of it. He drove her to doctor's appointments, carried groceries up the creaking stairs of her apartment, even fixed the leaky faucet in her kitchen with a stubborn determination that made her laugh. For a man who had entire staffs at his beck and call, Ethan Blackwood rolling up his sleeves and wrestling with rusty pipes was almost absurd. Yet it was in those moments Clara felt her walls tremble that he wasn't trying to buy her. He wasn't trying to control her. He was simply there. And for someone who had been abandoned before, there meant everything. One evening, after a long day, Clara sat with Ethan on her couch. The baby shifted inside her, restless, and she winced softly. "You okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Yeah," she said, pressing her hand against her belly. "Just active tonight." Ethan hesitated, then asked, "Can I?" He gestured awkwardly toward her stomach. Clara's heart caught in her throat. She had never let anyone close in this way, not since Daniel. But something in Ethan's eyes, the softness rarely seen behind his steel exterior, made her nod slowly, carefully. He placed his hand on her belly. For a moment, nothing. Then, a tiny kick thumped against his palm. Ethan froze. His breath hitched, his eyes widening. Did you feel that? Clara smiled through the lump in her throat. Yeah, that's your welcome. Ethan swallowed hard, something breaking open in his chest. He had closed himself off for so long, convinced he was incapable of connection, of family, of love. And yet, with one small kick, the walls he had built around his heart began to crumble. But redemption was never simple. One night, Clara's past came knocking. She was locking up the diner when a familiar voice stopped her cold. Clara! She turned, her breath catching. Daniel. The man who had abandoned her now stood in front of her, his smile nervous, his hands shoved into his pockets. He looked thinner, older, weighed down by guilt, or maybe just regret. What are you doing here? Clara's voice shook. I heard about the baby. About you. He stepped closer. I made a mistake, Clara. I was scared. But I want to be here now. Her stomach twisted. Months of loneliness, of struggling alone, of crying into her pillow. Now he came back, as if he could erase it with a few words. You don't get to do that, she whispered fiercely. You don't get to leave me when it's hard and come back when it's convenient. Daniel flinched. I love you. I always did. Let me prove it. Before Clara could respond, Ethan appeared at her side. His presence was steady, protective, but not possessive. He didn't speak, didn't claim, didn't demand. He simply stood beside her, letting her choose, and Clara chose. She looked at Daniel, her eyes blazing with a strength she hadn't realized she carried. Love doesn't abandon. Love doesn't disappear when it's inconvenient. You don't get another chance to hurt me or my child. Daniel's face crumpled, but Clara didn't waver. She turned and walked away, Ethan's quiet footsteps beside hers. For the first time, she felt free. Later, sitting in her apartment, Clara turned to Ethan, tears streaming silently. I didn't think I could do that. I thought I'd always be afraid. Ethan reached for her hand, his thumb brushing her knuckles. Fear doesn't make you weak, Clara. It makes you human. But facing it, that makes you stronger than anyone I've ever known. Her heart swelled, the ache of the past softening into something new. Forgiveness not for Daniel but for herself. For believing she wasn't enough. For carrying shame that was never hers to bear. And in Ethan's eyes, she saw something mirrored back, redemption. He was forgiving himself, too, for the boy who lost his mother, for the man who built walls so high he almost missed what was real. Clara had cracked those walls, not with force, but with kindness, with patience, with love he hadn't believed he deserved. That night, as they sat in the quiet, Ethan whispered words that had never come easily to him.